Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. For today's video, I wanted to go through the process of taking a plane that's cold and dark like this and then getting it from this state up into the air. And I wanted to compare it to something that I'm very familiar with and I'm sure you guys are very familiar with, which is driving a car. Because on the surface, it feels like these should be pretty similar, starting a plane, starting a car, but there are a lot of different steps. And as we'll find out shortly, a plane is a lot more modular than a car. So basically what we're going to do is just take you through what you need to enable, what you need to turn on, how you need to do that to get the plane running. Now when it comes to starting a car, if we just assume that you have a car that has a regular key, you're familiar with the process of basically getting in the car, sticking the key in the ignition and cranking it over. There's not really too much thought that has to go into it, apart from making sure that you have fuel, which is something we have to make sure of here as well. But it's important to know what is going on as you turn the key without obviously getting too nerdy and boring you to death. So when you turn the key into the ignition position, it's important to know what's getting armed. The most important thing that we will cover off compared to here is your fuel pump. So you may know that if you turn the key to ignition, you can actually hear your fuel pump prime, which is basically sending fuel to the engine ready to be used. We're going to have to do that here as well, except we need to do it in a very modular way, as I said. With a car, you have a battery that's always running. It's always waiting for you to come and turn it on. However, we don't have that with a plane, purely because you'd have a plane that could sit for a few months on end. So you're not going to be able to confidently walk up to a plane, assume that it has a working battery and just crank a key and away you go. So the way we're going to approach this is to basically satisfy the three needs that a plane engine has, just like with a car engine. They need fuel, air, and spark. And that's across the board, whether it's a plane, whether it's a car. So what we're first going to do, if we get rid of the yoke, we can see a few controls here. So the Cessna 152, and the reason I've chosen the Cessna 152 is because it's a very common aircraft for people to learn how to fly. If you load Microsoft Flight Sim and you go straight to the tutorial, this is the first plane you're going to fly. Now don't worry, you don't have to actually go through this entire process at all if you ever want to. As long as you choose a runway to start your flight on, the plane will be up and running and you won't have to do a thing. If you want to go through this process, you just need to choose a parking spot as your departure. As I say, you can see that the controls are laid out sort of categorically, if that makes sense. So over here we have our electronics and then we have our fuel. Now the Cessna 152 is a carbureted engine, so there are a few extra steps you can go towards depending on your location and also the weather. But because we're here in Sydney, Australia, we're not going to worry about what to do when it's ice cold or anything like that. We have things like this carb heat, which is going to help keep the carburetor free of ice. We're not going to have to worry about that today. And we also have primer, which is going to be used more for colder climates and also if the plane has been standing around dormant for ages. Once again, we're not going to worry about that. So the first thing I want to do is make sure that we have fuel available to the engine. As I said, we need fuel, air, and spark. And if we have a look down here, there's a little fuel valve. So at the moment it's saying that it's off. So from this point, it doesn't matter what we try and do with the engine, it's never going to get fuel. So first things first, let's flick that to on. So that's now sorted, we have fuel that's going to be made available. Here we have what is called the mixture. Now once again, without getting too nerdy and boring, essentially the mixture refers to how much fuel to how much air. This becomes more important in climates where you're high up, you've got a high altitude. The closer to sea level you are, in our case we're basically at sea level, we can just crank that puppy all the way to full. Just send as much fuel as you can, she's going to be fine, she'll take it. Being a carbureted engine, we want to give a little bit of throttle. Not too much, but just a little bit to crack open the throttle, help get some air and some fuel flowing through. It'll just make things a little bit smoother. I think in the simulator you can basically have the throttle all the way off, it'll still start. However, best practice, let's just give it a little bit of throttle to get things going. I'm going to also match that on my stick. So you can see if I move my stick here, you can see the throttle's moving in and out. I can just use the mouse as well, but then it's going to be a little bit weird when I grab the throttle. So if I said I wanted 20 odd %, we'll just put it there. What does that? 12%. Okay, that'll be fine. Okay, so we've got fuel ready, we've got our mixture ready, we've got the throttle cracked. What we're now going to do is turn on our electronics. So our battery master switch, and you can see all of a sudden the dash is coming alive, as well as our alternator. So we've satisfied our fuel, we've satisfied the battery, so we've now got power available to us, which means we can now satisfy the spark. And we also need to make sure that our parking brake's on, which is fine, because last thing we need to do is run over old mate, which is going to get pretty awkward. But you can see at the moment there's still no action. The propeller's dead straight, nothing's happening. If we want to be a little bit more professional, shall I say, we can do things like we can turn our strobe and beacon on just to let people know that, you know, shit's about to get real. Let's just turn on all the lights, why not? And now this is probably the most car-like part of the day. This little key here for the magneto. This is what's going to give us our spark. So if you can see the propeller, it's dead straight at the moment. And as soon as I rotate this over to start, you can see it's spinning around. And if you have a look over on the right, you can see our tachometer, it's now showing 1,000 RPM. And apparently we're going to get a pushback even though I didn't ask for it. Now, if we have a look down here, we can see that we have oil pressure, so that's good. We have fuel, we haven't put in tons of fuel, we've only got half a tank, which is fine. What we also have is we have our RPM over here sitting at 1,000, which is happy. We can bring that down if we'd like. Essentially, for the moment, that's about it. Once again, you can see how it's a bit modular compared to a car. Just jump in, rotate a key, job done. Here, we've actually got to go through the steps of allowing fuel to flow. We need to turn on our electronics. We then need to make sure that our mixture's set and all that. And this is obviously going to be very different plane to plane. Is he staring into my soul? Settle down. Thirsty boy. So I'm not entirely sure why we're getting a pushback when we're in such a little plane. If we have a look around, what the hell are we being pushed back for? That's just weird. So now that we've actually got the plane started, I want to talk about how to control it on the ground. Once again, when you control a car, you think you give it throttle, you give it brake, and you give it steering. And that's essentially what we're going to do here, except we can't just use a steering wheel. We can't just use our joystick left and right, which obviously you'd probably be familiar with that in the sky. You're going to use the joystick to rotate, and you can see our ailerons working as we move the joystick. However, this has no power here on the ground. It's not going to do a single thing. What we need to do to be able to move ourselves side to side is use our rudder, which if you have a look at the red tail, the end of the tail, if I twist, you can see that. That's our rudder. So we still use our throttle. Obviously, we can use our brakes, but this is what's actually going to move us around. So there are no brakes on. If I just tip into the throttle, we're going to start moving forward. But if I use our aileron, we're going nowhere. And old mate's about to get crushed. But if we use our rudder, you can see all of a sudden, we're now moving. Pretty similar to a car, just, I guess, a little bit backwards, if that makes any sense. As I said, the side-to-side movement here, that's not going to do a single thing. You actually need to use your rudder. And that's going to be the same for takeoff. So when we're going to go take off, we need to use our rudder to try and keep us as straight as possible down the runway. The side-to-side action of your stick is going to do absolutely nothing. Now, as far as sensitivity goes, I'm actually not certain how sensitive a rudder is in real life. I've never flown a plane, but I know here in flight sim, the way that I've got my stick set up, because I haven't gone through and done any customization, it is twitchy as hell. What we're going to look at as we're taking off, we're going to have a look at our RPM, and that's the exact same as if you were driving a car. That's just your revolutions per minute of the engine. They've even gone so far as to give you a little green section to know what's good and a little red section to let you know what's bad. There's no VTEC here. We're only going to be at about 2,000 RPM. As we're taking off, we want to have a look at our airspeed. So this performs the exact same as a speedometer in a car. It's marked in knots. And there's a few little sections which we can get into later on if you want. Essentially the green is that's all good, that's happy. Yellow, you're putting the plane under a bit of stress, you probably don't want to be there. The other thing that's important to note is this little grey bar inside. Now the reason I want to point that out is because that's your flap territory. So here we're taking off from a pretty long runway, so we don't need to worry about flaps, and especially if we were coming into land, I don't think we'd have to worry about flaps. If you are going to do a landing on a shorter runway, or you need to get up off the ground pretty quick, and you want to dial in some flap, you just need to make sure that you're within this range, but we can worry about that later. This little fella down here, that's our heading, so that's just telling us which way we're pointing, pretty self-explanatory. Our clock, you can figure that one out. This is telling us how high we are off the ground. So allegedly at the moment we're sitting at 700 feet above the ground. This operates the same as a clock really. The small hand will do thousands of feet. The big hand does hundreds of feet. This little fella here, this is our attitude indicator. I love that name, attitude indicator. This is basically telling you where the nose is pointed. So blue sky, brown dirt. That'll show you things like how far up or how far down the nose is pointed, and also when you're turning, these little wings will correspond with these little indices here to let you know how sharp your banking is. And then here we have our vertical speed, and that does exactly what it says on the tin. If this needle goes up, it's telling you that you're climbing at a certain speed, and if your needle goes down, you're descending. So this is in hundreds of feet per minute. So if you wanted to go from here, which is basically sea level, up to 1,000 feet in a minute, you'd want that needle to go up to there. It'll make a bit more sense as we take off, but I think that's enough for now. Let's just basically dip some throttle in, watch the RPM. It's going up as I put throttle in. You'll slowly see the airspeed will start to kick in. And it's a bit of a windy day here in Sydney and rainy and whatever, so I apologise that this plane's probably going to knock about a fair amount. But you can see the airspeed starting to come in. Oh, that was rough as guts, but if we pull up, you'll now notice the vertical speed down the bottom, that's going up. So we're climbing at 500 to 1,000 feet per minute. You can see our attitude indicator is now pointing to the sky. You can see our RPM over on the right. It's currently sitting close to the red, but that's fine. And our airspeed's just ticking up. We're about 75 knots at the moment. So we could at the moment still use flaps if we wanted, but we don't need flaps. And you can see our altitude is gaining. We're going to be at 1,000 feet in no time. If we look at our vertical speed again down the bottom, we're currently still climbing at 1,000 feet per minute. And if we go to look outside the plane, that's exactly what's happening. We're going up. And you can see, because we've got all the indicators enabled here at the moment, we can still see the same information that we could see inside the plane. So vertical speed is about 1,000 feet per minute. You can see our altitude is going up. You can see our airspeed is currently around 65, 70 knots. Our engine is working close to 2,500 RPM. That was just basically taking a plane from cold and dark, turning it on and getting moving, just like as if you were going to jump in your car and just drive down the road. And also just covering off things like having to use the rudder to actually move the plane on the ground. And actually going to that point, now that we're in the sky, you'll notice if I move my stick left and right, now all of a sudden the ailerons, they will make the plane move. And that's because we're moving through the air. Just like now, if I jam the park brake on, nothing happens. If I jam the brakes on, nothing happens, because the wheels have no contact. There's obviously a few extra dimensions to think about with a plane compared to a car, and this isn't even then going on to the fact that you had to have gone around the plane to make sure that there was no defects or issues. You have to go through and make sure that all the controls are blah, blah, blah. There is so much more. It's just insane. But that is the real basics of taking a plane such as the Cessna 152 from cold and dark to up in the sky. So if you enjoyed that video, please give it a thumbs up. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes, and I'll see you in the next video.